So in this video, I'm going to explain why suffering means that certain kinds of gods can't possibly exist. Let's start with a discussion of what you'd do if a friend of yours was suffering. Let's say a friend of yours was getting his ass kicked, and you knew you could stop the ass kicking. You knew about the ass kicking, and you knew that you could stop it. That didn't just think you could, didn't just have a guess, but knew better than you know anything else that you could stop this ass kicking. You care about your friend, you'd stop the ass kicking. Let's say you could do it effortlessly. Well, if there was any hesitation before, certainly now, there'd be no hesitation. Does that mean you'd stop all the sufferings your friend was encountering? Well, no. You wouldn't take your friend's study notes away so that that friend wouldn't have to suffer the effort of studying for an examination. You wouldn't unplug a treadmill so the friend wouldn't suffer the unpleasantness of forcing yourself to exercise. You wouldn't replace your friend's diet food with ice cream so your friend wouldn't suffer being a little hungry while she is trying to lose some weight. So you wouldn't stop all suffering, just suffering that's not fair, that isn't needed to get your friend to be in a better place. What's this have to do with a god? Well, the most popular version of a god is a god that has certain properties. And a god with these properties is in contradiction with the world as we know it. This god has omnipotence, which means he can do anything that's not a logical contradiction. So he couldn't make a squared circle or make a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it, but he could make a rock of any weight, and he could lift a rock of any weight. He could make a square, he could make a circle. This god is also supposed to be all-loving, which means every one of his creations he loves. Now, some people might get a little squirrely about this, but I would suggest this should apply not just to the humans, but to all of the creations. This God is supposed to be omnipresent. He's supposed to be everywhere. He's supposed to know everything. Some people say, it doesn't specifically say omniscience in the Bible. No, but it's pretty close, and the implication is that anything that can be known, the God knows. So anything you and I know, that God should know based on the most popular iterations. So if you're believing in a God that's all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, and he's everywhere all the time, or he doesn't even have to be all-knowing, you just have to be everywhere all the time, or instead of being everywhere all the time, know everything. Either way does the trick. And there is unnecessary suffering, that God can't exist. Is there unnecessary suffering? Well, do people incur terrible genetic diseases that they can't possibly learn something from? Yes. People suffer these awful conditions all the time, and they're not going to get any stronger for it. What about in the wild? There are certain creatures that their whole lives, all they are is a host for another creature. There are some creatures that essentially are just used for another insect to lay the eggs in the brain. That creature, then its whole life is just torture. And the god is allowing this. What about incidents where somebody is being assaulted? So you could say, well, if the god interferes here, he'll stop free will. Well, and I'll credit Dark Matter for this idea that I've gotten from one of his videos. I'll put a link in the description below for that. Is in the situation of somebody being assaulted, there's already free will being violated. The assailant and the victim, right? The victim's free will is being violated by the assailant. If a god steps in and stops the assault, the assailant's free will is violated, but then the victim gets his free will back. So there is definitely a net change in free will. It's completely unnecessary to allow these assaults. So in the case of the assault, the god is forced to have a situation where somebody's free will is getting violated. This god has decided that he'd prefer that the victim's free will get violated. You know why we don't have to be told that somebody like Superman cares about people? Because he doesn't sit there wondering, am I going to violate the attacker's free will? He just stops the bad thing from happening. With a God, if you want to say that this God is caring, loving, and yet still have it be in this world, you have to come up with these crazy mental games to explain why he's sitting there watching as people are getting attacked and doing nothing about it. There are things you've seen on the news, right? Of the people who've been held in a basement for, decades, being violated daily. If you believe in a God that knows about everything or is everywhere and could do anything, that God sat there, arms crossed, watching and doing not a damn thing to help these people for decades as they're getting violated. That God is supposedly loving them. That God supposedly cares. That God, if a God exists that knows about these things and could stop them, that God does not give a shit. That God does not care. That God is wicked. There's no such thing as wicked, but that God is cold, callous, and definitely not worthy of praise. I mean, I could easily come up with just tons and tons of times where people are suffering, animals are suffering, and there's no benefit to it. Nothing is getting stronger, nothing is learning a lesson, nothing is getting closer to a God from this. Hell, some of these sufferings take people further away from a God. They'll say, well, if this horrible shit can happen, well, there couldn't possibly be a God. I somewhat fall into that category. That was part of what drove me away from the belief in a God, was seeing just what kinds of things do happen and are not intervened. If you are in a religion where your God necessarily has the properties of being all-loving, all-powerful, and either all-knowing or everywhere all the time, that God can't exist. Because that God either knows about and or is currently watching all unnecessary suffering, could easily, effortlessly stop all of it, and is choosing not to, despite supposedly loving everyone.